So we'll be looking at animal and plant cells really closely in this video and the different types of organelles that are within cells. Now, organelles are kind of like tiny organs. So you have organs and cells, so each individual cell that makes up your body has organelles in them that helps that cell carry out its function. And now remember, our unit phenomenon is how do organisms repair an injury. Now these organelles are important in how cells function, and some cells really help us repair most of our injuries. So remember, the cell is the basic unit of life. That was one of the parts of the cell theory. So there was 3 parts of the cell theory. All organisms are made of cells, either one or more than one or billions. The cell is the basic unit of life, or the building block of life, in structure and in function. So we haven't found anything that is smaller than the cell that is considered to be alive. And then all cells divide to form new cells. So they reproduce. Important organelles. So we're going to be talking about plant and animal cells over the next couple of weeks. So what you see that I'm holding is the outside of an animal cell. So that outside is what we call the cell membrane, and it holds all these parts to the cell that we call organelles together. So an organelle is kind of like what you would see inside you, like your heart is an organ or your liver is an organ. So there's all sorts of organelles inside a cell. So let's cut this cell in half, and then we get what we see here. Okay, this is an animal cell, and it has all these organelles inside of it. Now, each of these organelles has their own sort of function that help the cell do what it needs, okay? So some animals are single-celled, but many of them are multicellular. So each cell has its own special job or function, and it needs all these organelles in order to carry out those functions. So for 6th grade, we focus on certain organelles. So I'm going to take away some. Take away that one, and this one, and these ones, this one, and this one. And so we're going to focus on some specific organelles. And these organelles that you see inside this cell are the ones we're going to focus on. The cell membrane is this outer wall that goes all the way around the cell to keep all of the organelles in here. And all this stuff in between the organelles is what we call cytoplasm. It's kind of like a jelly substance. And this here in the center is what we call the nucleus. This is where DNA is stored, okay? And the DNA is the genetic material that tells the cell what it is. That it's an animal cell, that maybe it's a heart cell, and it's going to help your heart pump blood, okay? Or maybe it's just a single-celled bacteria, so it houses all the genetic material for that one bacteria. These things are what we call mitochondria, okay? And mitochondria, what is named, or their nickname, is the powerhouse of the cell. This is what controls your energy levels, okay? So you need mitochondria to help give you energy, okay? And so they're going to help with transferring food to make that food into energy. So that's kind of their job. And then we have these smaller little pieces here that are called vacuoles, and they kind of just hold on to liquid, mostly water. They're very small in animal cells. So that is sort of the organelles. Remember, they're the parts of a cell that help it function as a whole, kind of like you having organs that help you function. So that is the animal cell. The animal cell. So in middle school, we're going to look at certain organelles. There are many more organelles than what we're going to talk about, but we're going to talk about some of the more important organelles that help with the structure of the cell, the structure of the organism, and its basic function as a cell, and then once many cells come together to form organs and tissues, what they carry out as a function. So the cell membrane is very important. It allows all the organelles to be held together. And then all the organelles lie inside that cell membrane. And the cell membrane in an animal can kind of move back and forth. You can push on it if need be, so it's not as rigid as what we'll find in a plant cell. The nucleus is the control center, so we have DNA and genetic material that tells the cell what it needs to do. Mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, so energy is going to happen here. So there's going to be chemical reactions that happen in the mitochondria in order for us to get our energy. So when we eat food, some of that basic nutrients in the food helps the mitochondria so that we can get energy to carry out our function as a huge organism of a human. And then the cytoplasm is kind of encompasses the whole cell, and the organelles kind of move around in the cytoplasm. It's almost like kind of like a cushion, so they're less likely to get damaged. So next is the plant cell. You can kind of see that it is boxy compared to sort of the round shape that the animal cell was in, because the animal cell has this cell membrane that allows it to kind of take the shape of kind of what's around it. So it's kind of squishy. Whereas the animal cell you can see is more, where you can see the plant cell is more boxy. Okay? And then we look up here and we can see our plant cell. Okay? And it is boxy. So we're going to take away some of the organelles that we aren't going to talk about. And the plant cell has a big difference than an animal cell. It has what's called a cell wall, which makes it nice and rigid, okay? If you think of celery, celery has a nice rigid cell wall. So then we're going to take away, so we took away some of the organelles. Some are the same, like mitochondria and your nucleus, where the DNA is stored, are the same. But then you have a huge vacuole in plant cells that holds on to all that water that it may need. And then we have these other things that's called chloroplast. And inside them they have chlorophyll, because plants take sunlight and change that sunlight into food. So that's how they get their food. So they need specialized organelles to help them capture their food. So remember, the main difference between animal and plant cells is their cell wall and their huge vacuole, which holds on to water. They still have mitochondria that allows them to use their food to make energy. So the important organelles in a plant cell. So a plant cell has a cell membrane just like an animal cell, except it is inside the cell wall and it has the same function. The plant cell has a nucleus. It also has the same function as an animal cell. It holds the DNA and is kind of like the brain of the operation of the plant cell. Mitochondria are also in a plant cell, and they help it with energy. And then cytoplasm, which is that jelly-like substance that cushions all the organelles. So those are all similar organelles from plant to animal cell. Plant cells have some other organelles that animal cells don't, such as the cell wall, which is the tough, rigid outer layer. It's what makes plants so rigid. Like think of a celery stalk or the stalk on broccoli or a tree trunk. To make it stand up like that and grow like that, it has this tough outer cell wall, okay, that's very rigid. It doesn't bend easily. And then the chloroplast, okay, this is where plants can make their food. And the chloroplasts have what's called chlorophyll in them. This is a green pigment, and it allows the leaves to look green, and then it helps make food from sun. So they take in sunlight, and through a process called photosynthesis, they make sugar, and that's how they feed and eat to get energy for the mitochondria, and so that the cells can carry out all their functions. And then they have a central vacuole. Animal cells can have a vacuole, but they're very tiny, and there's a few of them. But a central vacuole in a plant cell can be really big and almost take up the whole cell. And it's this huge bubble that stores water, food, and waste. And then it can help some of that disperse and go through the cell membrane and cell wall. Okay? But in plants, it most likely is holding on to water. Okay? They need water, whether the water's coming up from the roots or it's coming from other sources. So that is some of the distinct differences between plant and animal cells. So here is a basic plant cell with the different parts that we've been talking about that are labeled. They're not that detailed, but it sort of shows you size kind of comparison, and it sort of gives you this rigid kind of square-like structure for the cell wall. So it is rigid, and they tend to be more square, rectangular shaped as a plant cell. And then here's another simplistic view of an animal cell. You see that the cell membrane is not quite as rigid and can kind of move with if other cells push against it, so that stuff doesn't get damaged. It can kind of move with other things that are happening.